than the usual amount of time that we waste on technical difficulties. You've actually been faster in the last 3 or 4 times we've done this, so good job. We're off to a great start. This is Harald Wiltsche. He's a full professor at the University of Copenhagen, and he works on philosophy of science, epistemology, phenomenology, and he's going to tell us today something about rationality. Take it away, Harald.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, to all of you for being in here to my talk. Second of all, Mike, thanks so much for the invitation and for the opportunity to tell you a little bit about parts of my work. So, what's this talk going to be about? Well, you know, when I first thought about a suitable topic for this talk today, I first thought whether I should perhaps present something, you know, more mainstream philosophy of science stuff. But then I thought, well, why not talking about a philosophical figure who I think is still a little bit understudied, a little perhaps also undervalued, especially in analytics routes. I mean, of course, Edmund Husserl is not a stranger really to anyone, but my impression sometimes when I talk to people is that what most people know about Husserl is, well, he's the founding father of phenomenology, he's the author of logical investigations, he argued against psychologism after Frege set his head straight, and then maybe that Husserl is the kind of the snowball that later turned into this avalanche of Heideggerian, hermeneutic, French, postmodern, continental philosophy. And even though I do not deny that there is a grain of truth to such a narrative, I still think that there is more to Husserl. And to a certain extent, this talk today is, I think, the attempt to you know, give you an impression of really the scope and the depth, and also the kind of philosophy Husserl is perhaps not so much known for. And I will want to do that by looking at one topic in particular, namely Husserl's take on rationality. I mean, with every major philosophical figure in the 20th century, you have, of course, a truckload of secondary literature, and Husserl is no exception to that. Rather surprisingly, though, there is almost nothing on Husserl on rationality, which is surprising, I think, for, I would say, at least 3 reasons. First of all, by itself, rationality is a super fundamental topic, of course. I mean, every philosopher with systematic aspirations, and Husserl definitely was one of those, has to say something about rationality at some point in their works. I mean, rationality is such a fundamental concept that it really undercuts, you know, the distinctions you have in some academic cultures between theoretical philosophy and practical philosophy. The second reason why it's surprising that there isn't much on Husserl and rationality is that, as I will argue, Husserl's epistemology, which I think really is the heart and the soul of this whole project of phenomenology, really requires a rather strong notion of rationality in order to work. And Husserl was aware of that. I mean, he devoted almost the entire 4th part of Ideas 1, which is one of his major works, to spelling out in quite some detail what rationality actually is, and he really tried to develop a phenomenological theory of rationality. The third and final reason why I find it somewhat surprising that there isn't much in Husserl and rationality is that, as it stands, Husserl's theory simply does not work. It doesn't work due to certain ambiguities, also certain internal inconsistencies, and I think that is really the main task I I have in this talk today to kind of identify some of what I would say are the key problems, the main problems in Husserl's existent theory, and then try to come up with something which is the modified version of that theory, which can really also be defended in the arena of more general philosophical discussion. If you could go to the next slide, please. That's the structure of my talk. I will not assume any prior knowledge about Husserl. So I will start with really kind of getting you into the picture a little bit with regard to Husserl's philosophy, and I will do so by really giving you a very, very, very rough and ready general overview of some of the basic tenets really in Husserlian epistemology. And building on that, in the second part, I will then talk about the relation between epistemology as Husserl thinks about the whole project and how that is connected to the concept of rationality, and also what Husserl's own theory was. And I will do that by introducing what I will call the phenomenological condition of rationality, PCR. It only later occurred to me that this might not be, in times of COVID, the nicest shorthand for phenomenological condition of rationality. Yeah, it is what it is. It's too late. I will then come to the kind of critical part of my talk, and I will first identify something which maybe is not even that much of a problem. It's probably more an ambiguity in the way Husserl formulates this phenomenological condition of rationality. I will go through a couple of cases, almost perhaps thought experiments, in order to arrive at something which I consider to be a defensible and sufficiently precise formulation of the phenomenological condition of rationality. I will then identify a second problem, and I think this time the problem really has to do with the logical form in which Husserl expresses the logical condition of rationality. I think there is a problem with that. I will first identify the problem and then try to offer a solution for that. And in order to wrap things up in the end and also make perhaps a little bit more concrete, I will try to, in the fifth part of the talk, to apply this whole theory to a concrete case in order to also make a little bit clearer how this is supposed to look like in the real world. All right, so much for my plans for today. At any point, if you find something hard to follow, do not understand, if I'm using weird terminology, which I will most certainly do, please just stop me and ask. Absolutely no problem. Okay, next slide, please. Let's, without much further ado, start with talking about Husserlian epistemology. What is it, and where do we start? Well, that's actually one of the nice things about Husserlian phenomenology. You always know where to start, because it doesn't really matter if you're interested in metaphysics or in ethics or philosophy of language or epistemology or philosophy of science. With Husserl, the natural place to start always is his preferred theory of consciousness intentionality. That's maybe also what makes, from a contemporary perspective, Husserl such a weird case in a way, because whatever you're interested in, you typically start out from what today would be philosophy of mind. So, intentionality, what is it? Well, you know, typically what people say is intentionality is the feature of conscious experiences to be about something, to be directed at something. People say things like, we do not only, perceive, doubt, or imagine, perceive something. We doubt something, we imagine something. Another important feature of consciousness, and of course Husserl is not the first one to talk about this is that somehow we have the ability to be intentionally directed at one and the same object through quite different kinds of intentional acts, or by virtue of quite different intentional acts. I can now perceive my bike in the office, I can imagine my bike in the office, I can, I don't know, doubt that my bike is in the office. And in order to capture this capacity of consciousness, Husserl in the logical investigation introduces this very, very fundamental distinction between what he calls intentional quality on the one hand and intentional matter on the other. Later this will turn into a distinction between noesis and noema and ideas one, but for the moment let's just stick to this terminology. Intentional quality denotes the kind of intentional act through or by virtue of which new experience is determined as a particular type of experience, whereas intentional matter is that part of an experience that determines what the experience is about, like in the case from before, my bike being in the office. Now, different intentional qualities can be combined with one and the same intentional matter, and different intentional matters can be combined with the same intentional quality. What you cannot have, however, in a quite similar sense in which there is no tone without the pitch, would be intentional quality completely disconnected from intentional matter, or intentional matter completely disconnected from any kind of intentional quality. There are some rare exceptions to that. That's also the reason why in the first set of the slides I'm saying most conscious experience. Because, I mean, there are cases like dizziness, for instance. It seems to be an intentional quality. We seem to know how it feels. We seem to be very easily able to distinguish it from other kinds of intentional qualities, but what would be the intentional matter? That doesn't seem to be something like an object at which this is directed. And you could perhaps find similar examples. A timely one, even though I'm not sure if it's just a metaphorical way to talk, would be, for instance, Weltschmerz. We know, especially now, how it feels, but really, what is it directed at? So, but these are special problems which are not really crucial for what I'm about to say. So, next slide, please. This distinction between intentional quality and matter is super important, is super useful to describe certain things we can do, but that's definitely not sufficient. Then in order to show why, consider the following two cases or scenarios. The first would be me judging that my bike's in the office while I'm sitting in the cafeteria having a cappuccino. And the second scenario would be me judging that my bike's in the office while I'm right there in my office, standing in front of my bike, looking straight at it. So, thinking about what the difference between these two scenarios is, I think it's pretty clear that it is not a difference between, or a difference that can be captured with the distinction between intentional quality and intentional matter alone, because regarding those two aspects, the two scenarios are exactly on par. I mean, in both cases, it's me judging, and in both cases, the intentional matter is my bike's whereabouts. But of course, epistemologically speaking, there is a very fundamental difference between these two scenarios, because, I mean, for all I know, me judging that my bike's in the office while I'm still in the cafeteria could really only be a wild guess, whereas standing right in front of it, direct acquaintance with my bike is probably as good as a justification for my belief that my bike's in the office as I can get, at least in the sphere of perceptual experience. And it is really this difference between these two cases that I think go right to the core of what Husserlian phenomenological epistemology is all about. In the first scenario, the object of my intention is only intended emptily. I am directed at my bike's whereabouts, but my bike is at the same time also immediately given to me. Whereas that's exactly what happens in scenario 2. My intention towards the bike, and here's a little bit of phenomenology lingo for you now. My intention is also fulfilled by the originary givenness of the very object in question, of the intended object. Phenomenologists have different ways to express this. Sometimes they talk about bodily presence of the intended thing and so on. But what is meant, you're intentionally directed towards something, and this something is also immediately given to you, and that's the moment of fulfillment. Phenomenological epistemology is actually all about. Next slide, please. So this difference between empty and fulfilled intentions really is, I think, the core of Husserl's overall position. I mean, if you get this kind of idea Husserl has here, then I think you have the core idea of what epistemology and Husserlianity is about. Of course, there are many more details and there are many more qualifications to that, but this is really the core idea. And at the end of the day, again, with a lot of qualification, it's also this distinction that ultimately marks for Husserlian the difference between knowledge and mere belief. So I think really we can summarize this first introduction to Husserlian epistemology with the following condition. So if an object is not only emptily intended, but B, the intention is also fulfilled by the object's originary givenness, and if C, the experiencing subject registers the congruence between intention and originary givenness, then we're dealing with what Walter Hoppe calls knowledge at its best. Walter Hoppe, by the way, I would say one of the most prolific epistemologists in the phenomenological tradition at the moment. All right, so next slide, please. This basic idea of epistemology, I'm now moving to the second part of my talk, is also what's in the background of a very famous thing in Husserlian phenomenology, the so-called principle of all principles. It's a kind of a meta-philosophical maxim. Husserl introduces an idea as one. I'm going to read it out also for you. Embrace the peculiar language Husserl is so famous for. Many phenomenologists by extension, I think. Every originary perceptive intuition is a legitimizing source of cognition. Everything originarily offered to us in intuition is to be accepted as simply as what it is presented as being, but also only within the limits in which it is presented here. If you think that the linguistic weirdness comes from some translation, no, it's the same. Lots of things have been said about this principle of all principles. In what follows, I will give you my take on it. Because I think really to what it comes down to is that this principle of all principles expresses kind of two theses, related theses of course, one about the architecture of knowledge and the other one about epistemic justification. I will briefly talk about these two in turn. So next slide, please. All right, so let's start with the first part. I'm a little bit slow here because I always have my own slides here and I also have to get to the right one here as well. Why doesn't this work? All right, now. So let's start with the first part of the principles. With this part, every originary perceptive intuition is a legitimizing source of cognition. The way I read this, what's expressed here is a form of moderate foundationalism. So the idea here is basically that the body of knowledge in general is foundational in a special. It's foundational in the sense that first, every piece of knowledge is either direct or indirect, and second, all pieces of indirect knowledge require one or more pieces of direct knowledge for their justification. That would be the overall. Why do I call this form of foundationalism moderate? Well, because it's very clear that Husserl acknowledges different kinds of non-foundational factors. Most importantly, of course, coherence between existing beliefs. But still, at the end of the day, I think what's quite crucial for Husserl's overall position is that if there is indirect knowledge, there must be pieces of direct knowledge as a foundation of it, even if you have additional non-foundational factors, such as coherence between existing beliefs. Next slide, please. The other part of the principle of all principles, so this everything originally offered to us in intuition is to be accepted as simply as what it is presented as being, on my view, expresses an eternalist view of epistemic justification. So what Husserl wants to say here is the source of epistemic justification is internal to a person's subjective acts. And more concretely, how Husserl on many pages tries to spell out the idea is that epistemic justification needs to be spelled out in terms of the quality of original givenness. And I think how one can summarize all of this is with the following condition: if S is empty attention, then P is fulfilled by P being originally given to S, then S has direct prima facie justification for believing that P. I think this is also, and I did a little bit of work of that in papers. I think from this condition or principle, it also becomes quite obvious that Husserl's position is quite similar to Michael Humer's phenomenal conservatism, or also James Pryor's work. I think there are a lot of interesting connections there, if one is interested to kind of reintroduce Husserl in the contemporary analytic debate about epistemology. All right, next slide, please. So far, I tried to give you a picture of what Husserl epistemology is all about, but of course, I mean, this is a talk about rationality, so the question that's quite natural at this point, what does any of this have to do with rationality? Because that was one of the things I said in the beginning, that one of my claims is that the overall Husserlian position requires a quite strong notion of rationality. So what's up with that? There is, of course, a much longer and much more detailed story, but the short version really is, according to Husserl, and this is the basic idea I tried to convey, the experience of in immediate contact with the intended objects really is the ultimate source for justification of our beliefs about these objects. But if you go down this road, if this is the core idea of your epistemology, there is a very practical concern here. Namely, how does this idea sit with the fact that, of course, most of what we know is only known indirectly? I mean, how promising really is it to build an entire epistemology on a quality that we hardly ever experience in our epistemologically more interesting endeavors? And I mean, one could either refer to cases of scientific knowledge, where most of the stuff we're interested in is in principle not able to be intended in the way which is described in Husserlian epistemology, but even in more mundane examples. I mean, like, I have this weird obsession with being very much interested in Mount Everest. I find Mount Everest endlessly interesting. And I claim to know, for instance, that the Hillary step, which was the last bump you need to go before you're on top of Mount Everest, doesn't exist anymore. No one knows really why, but there seems to be have been some kind of heavy storm, and now all of a sudden Hillary's has come, and I claim to have knowledge about that. Did I have the moment of originary giveness with regard to any of these things? Hell no, I could never go up there. Even though I'm from Austria, I'm a really, really bad mountain climber. So no way could I have the epistemically special moment Husserl seems to require is epistemology. So as a phenomenologist, of course, I have to ask myself, well, how to make sense of all of this. Next slide, please. I think this is exactly the point in the whole discussion where rationality comes into play, and where what I want to call phenomenological condition of rationality comes into. I read out what I consider to be the most on-point, most concise passage you can find in Husserl that I think gives the first indication of what the idea in Husserl is. The positive characteristic has as its own a specific rational character as a distinguishing mark accruing to it essentially, if and only if, it is a position on the basis of a fulfilled, originarily presentive sense and not merely on the basis of just any sense. This is again from Ideas 1. So the basic idea, and I will go into this much more detail in what follows now, but the basic idea really is that this principle of all principles, so these two interrelated theses about the architecture of knowledge and the nature of epistemic justification, isn't primarily really a description of knowledge and justification. The originary givenness is much more to be understood as this kind of ideal, or this telos really, towards which we strive if we aim at being, talking, judging rational. So I think that's really the basic idea. Rationality would be kind of normative direction. Our whole epistemic endeavors have in all different kinds of areas. That's the reason why rationality is so crucially important for the Husserlian project. But and I mean, this is a general problem, not only with Husserl. I mean, this is also a problem if you're interested in, I don't know, the Neo-Kantians or, the late 19th century stuff or whatever. I mean, you might find a lot of philosophical nuggets there, but usually it's kind of a little bit the precision that's perhaps lacking. And I think this is also the problem of Husserl here. And what I will do now in the following is to take this basic idea of philological condition of rationality and try to spell it out more concretely, in a more concise way, we really know what we're talking about. Next, please. So, what will happen now is that I go through a couple of formulations, this philological condition of rationality, and then try to contrast these formulations with imaginary scenarios in order to make the problems more vivid these different formulations have. I will in the end arrive at a formulation which I think is sufficiently clear in order to really work with them. So my first formulation of this philological condition of rationality, PCR prime, I think is really the attempt to model the formulation as close on the Husserl quote as possible. And this suggestion would be to say, it is rational for us to believe that P, if and only if P is originally given to S. But, I mean, it's not very hard to see that this is not really a very good suggestion. I mean, consider a very simple case. You're in the Austrian Alps, you're on a hike with your old friend Harald, you see smoke behind a hill and you form the belief that you suppose there is a fire behind it, right? And I think this is the perfect rational thing to do. It's a rational thing to do based on the kind of background knowledge you have. It's irrational based on the inferential practices we're using. But according to Sarah Prime, this belief in this situation would come out as irrational because in this formulation, rationality is really strongly dependent on the de facto originary givenness of P. And this is, of course, a pretty absurd view to hold, because it basically would preclude the existence of any kind of indirect knowledge. And as we've seen earlier, Husserl, of course, acknowledges the existence of indirect knowledge. So this is a non-starter. Next slide, please. So the next suggestion would be to kind of liberalize this phenomenological condition of rationality by adding a modal qualification, and to say something like this. So PCR prime, it's rational for us to believe that P, if and only if it is possible that P is originally given to S. Now, the obvious advantage of this way to put things is that this does justice to the fact that we have indirect knowledge, and that quite generally our inferential machinery is capable to take us beyond the quite narrow sphere of originary givenness that's made sure now. But consider the following example. I hope to believe that neighbor's dog again vandalized our front yard while I was at the gym. And suppose furthermore that I really have good reasons for holding these beliefs. So there are traces of dog ponds all over the front yard. The dog, as a matter of fact, has a long history of doing things like that. I have my wife's very credible witness report of the dog vandalizing of front yard, and so on, and so on, and so on. But the problem is, according to PCR prime, this belief, like of course any other belief about the past, would come out as irrational, because as a matter of fact, it is not possible for me to bring the content of my belief to original givenness. I can't go back to the time when the dog was about vandalizing my front yard. So I think this again has to be modified, which brings me to the next page and to the next slide, to PCR prime, because I think the problem with the last example really was that, and this is a pretty fundamental insight in the overall philosophy of Husserl, and it took quite some time to realize that how important the intersubjective dimension, because Husserl sometimes is portrayed as this, methodological solipsist, all this talk about transcendental ego and very, very introspective method, and so on and so on. I think this is actually quite far from the truth, because Husserl, it took him some time, but he realized more and more and more, and rationality would just be one of the areas where this becomes quite obvious. You can't spell out rationality only based on the capabilities of singular subjects, or from the perspective of your own subjective perspective. And this must also go into the phenomenological condition of rationality, hence the following suggestion. It is rational for us to believe that P, if and only if it's possible, that P is originally given to a member of S's epistemic community, S, of course, included. This version now has the advantage that, coming back to the example from before, my belief about the neighbor's dog vandalizing our front yard now comes out as rational, because the corresponding state of affairs would have been given originally to any suitably located member of S's community, to my wife. Even would I have been there, I would have seen doing the dog doing its thing. But what about this? Suppose I believe that Boulder, lying on the far side of Kepler 452b, Kepler 452b being one of the most Earth-like planets we know of, and we also have a pretty good reason to believe that it's a very rocky planet. So yeah, it's quite rational to believe that there is a boulder on the far side of Kepler 452b. But of course, the problem is, no member of my epistemic community, me neither, could possibly travel distances necessary in order to bring the corresponding belief to originary givens. Hence, next slide please, final suggestion, and this is now really what I think we should end up with. It is rational for us to believe that P, if and only if it is possible that P is originally given to an actual or possible member of S's community, S included. Now, the whole thing with Kepler 452b is no problem anymore. And I think really, for the sake also of this talk, I think this is a precise enough formulation of P star. I think it corresponds also to how Husserl's thinking, especially after Ideas 1, but even within Ideas 1, developed. And I think it can deal with the counter examples I have discussed so far. So that's now the task of making PCR more precise. I want now to move on to the second problem I have with Husserl's theory. The next slide, please. So, looking back at discussion so far, looking back at Husserl's original formulation of the phenomenological condition of rationality, all of my reformulations we considered now, there is really one salient feature that all of these formulations show. Namely, they are all expressed in the form of a bicondition. And the reason for that is quite clear, because on the basis of what Husserl wants to say in his epistemology, and then also on top of that in his theory of rationality, a simple conditional statement wouldn't suffice for what Husserl wants to express. Because the important message for Husserl is that rationality can't be had. This in the sense specified before with the different formulations of PCR. So what you cannot have in the formulation of PCR is a situation where the truth value of the antecedent is decoupled from that of the consequent, and hence a biconditional to rule out this possibility. But this is the problem. The biconditional strategy produces problems on its own, as I want to make it clear again with a concrete example. Next slide, please. Imagine, one of philosophers' favorites. Imagine a situation where S perceives a stick that's halfway submerged into water, so that S's visual senses present the stick as bent, classical bent stick sitting. Suppose furthermore that S has all the right kinds of background informations and background knowledge in order to make perfect sense of the situation. So what does that mean? It means that S has, like probably most adults, a very strong empirical intuition that changes in spatial form of solid objects are irreversible. So if you have a solid object, you break it, it usually doesn't jump back to being unbroken, right? That's what I mean. S also has the right kind of scientific background information. So S could, for instance, apply Snell's law and calculate exactly the refraction angles at the point at which the stick is submerged into water. And S could even tell you a wonderful causal story, about photons going back and forth between the stick, but going through different media and photons moving faster when they're traveling through air and slower when traveling through water, which results in photons from different parts of the stick hitting your rib at different times, yada, 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 and so on. So S could also tell you a wonderful causal story about how this situation comes about. But, and this is the catch, S still firmly holds the belief that the stick is actually bent when submerged into water. Now, I would assume that we all have the strong intuition that S, in holding this belief, while also having the kind of background knowledge I just spelled out, is irrational in holding that belief. But if we also accept that the bentness of the stick is actually originally given to S, I mean, her visual senses present the stick as bent to her. The problem is that under PCR, even under my final formulation, her belief comes out as rational. And that, of course, is a problem. Next slide, please. So, this presents a problem for Husserl's overall theory, and my question is, how can we fix this? And I would say the first thing we need to do is to take a step back and really look at what Husserl's overall aim with his whole theory of rationality is. What does he actually want to achieve? And I think there are actually two different motives which are quite important in Husserl. The first is, and I will show this in part with quotes, Husserl is interested in determining what he calls rationality in the widest sense, extended to all species of positings. So what this means, Husserl is interested in, and again a quote, universal judgments which have the characteristic of, as he calls it, eidetic universality, pure, or as it is also called, strict, absolutely unconditional universality. So part of what Husserl wants to achieve really is an a priori account of rationality that specifies the rules pertaining to any consciousness whatsoever being intentionally directed to any object whatsoever. Of course, one can be skeptical with regard to such a project, if that's at all feasible, but I think on an exegetical level, there can be no question that this is in part what Husserl actually wanted to achieve. Next slide, please. But at the same time, it's important to realize that Husserl is also in Ideas 1 and even more explicit in later works, very clear that such a general analysis, really spelling out in an a priori way the most general rules of rationality pertaining to any consciousness whatsoever, being directed to any kind of object whatsoever, is only, and again, quote, fashions a relative small piece of the phenomenology of Husserl. So that's not all there is to Husserl thinking about rationality. We do, and Husserl of course was aware of this, form beliefs about very different kinds of objects, and we do this in very different cognitive domains. In scientific domains, different scientific domains, but also of course in extra scientific domains. And hence, we should expect, and another quote, that each own specifically peculiar type of actualities carries along with its own peculiar constitutive phenomenology, and there a new concrete theory of reason. And Husserl goes on to specifically mention examples such as phenomenology, reason peculiar to physics, psychology, and natural sciences and such. So he has this idea that really, if you talk about rationality from a phenomenological perspective, there are two levels to consider. There is the most general a priori level where the most basic rules of rationality are spelled out, but then of course you have a kind of branching into much more specific areas how rationality would concretely play out in different cognitive areas in the sciences and extra scientific context, and so on and so on. So really it's an idea of having two layers to your overall theory of rationality. Next slide, please. So, yeah, as I just said, I think these remarks show that Husserl's theory of rationality really operates on two distinct levels. One, determining really domain-independent rules of rationality for any consciousness whatsoever being directed at any kind of object whatsoever. But building on that level, we also need to specify the more specific rules that govern rationality in different cognitive domains, such as everyday discourse or different areas of science. So that was just the repeating what I already said. Next slide, please. And this really, I think, leads to the following image. The overall position Husserl wants to spell out looks a little bit like this and really operates on two different levels. The first level is, in order to determine whether a need to consider first what I'd like to call, what also Husserl calls this way, its rational character. And the rational character is something that's specified according to P of rationality. This is the most general level on which rationality is specified, and there, as I said, originary givenness, in the way I described it before, in the main epistemic aim or motive. But, and this is, I think, the important thing, and also to a certain extent the solution to the problem from before, so the person looking at the bent stick, rational character is only a necessary, but not yet a sufficient conditional for something like over-rationality. In order to specify that, we need to move on the second level. In order to, for a belief to be reached full sense of the world, it must also exhibit concrete rationality and thus satisfy the conditions specific to the respective cognitive domain. And here, of course, the rules of a concrete rationality are much more context-dependent, and also they undergo a much stronger historical change. And I would consider this really to be one of the strengths of a theory that follows at least Husserl's lead about rationality. You have, on the one hand, this rather strong claim that there is a very fundamental level of really context-independent general rules of rationality, but then on top of that, you have concretizations of rationality, and these, of course, also undergo historical change. And you could see that, of course, in the sciences very clearly, because, I don't know, going from Aristotelian physics to Galileo to Newton to relativity and quantum mechanics, I think it's not only theories changing, it is really sometimes conceptions of rationality changing with that as well. Next slide. Let me now wrap things up. Look at the concrete example, and let's go back to the bent stick example from before. And I think Husserl's theory, as I try to spell it out now, fits actually quite well with this example. I mean, the first thing to notice is that to believe that the stick is actually bent while looking at the situation, it's not outright irrational. It's not just false. I mean, our visual senses present the stick as bent, as a matter of fact, which, from the perspective of the Husserlian theory, renders a respective belief into the stick actually being bent as rational in character, because it is in line with what's spelled out in the phenomenological condition of rationality. And this also, by the way, explains why optical illusions are not just perceptual errors. There is something more to that. They are more interesting. Next slide, please. However, the situation changes, and I think that solves the problem from before. If we move one step up, consider the level of concrete rationality. Because what's clear is that in the realm of perceptual experience, originary givenness through visual appearances usually has primacy in matters of justificatory force. I mean, that's how we usually justify beliefs about physical objects. We see stuff right in front of us, and we see stuff directly in front of us, and that's how we justify our beliefs about them. But perceptual competence, in a more all-encompassing way, involves much more than that. Next slide, please. To be a competent perceiver also means to know that sometimes the force of visual experiences can be overridden. And it can be overridden. For instance, if there are clashes with very strong, deeply ingrained empirical intuitions about reality, like the one I mentioned before, the one about the irreversibility of changes in spatial form of solid objects. I mean, that solid object, like sticks, if you break them, don't just jump back into being unbroken, is a pretty strong empirical intuition. And if particular visual appearances collide with that, of course, the force of visual experiences can be overridden in these cases. And the same is true with well-established scientific theories. I mean, if our normal visual experiences clash with accepted scientific theories, then usually the smart money is on scientific theory. And to know that is part of what it means to be a competent perceiver. Lastly, of course, the coherence between different perceptual modalities is something which is especially important in the bent stick case. If I were really unsure about whether the stick is bent or not, I mean, one way to kind of figure out what's happening would, of course, also be to touch the stick and then compare what my visual senses deliver me in terms of information and what I can feel by touching the thing. And that's also part of being a competent perceiver. And with that, I come to my final slide, which basically only says thanks.